Jesse in Fargo, who's got Real Presence Radio tuned in on his radio. Hi, Jesse. This is Catholic Answers Live. You're up next with Jimmy Akin.
Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy.
How you doing?
Just fine. What's your question?
So my question is, I'm just wondering, reading back to when Matthias replaces Judas as apostle, they determine it by lot, and also, like, after Moses, they use the Urim and the Thummim. The Thummim, yeah. How come we don't see any of that anymore? Why is that not used anymore? And honestly, it kind of seems like a strange practice.
Okay. Well, yeah, the discernment of God's will by the casting of lots or by the use of what were called the Urim and Thummim, that's something that was a practice in the Old Testament, and it was apparently divinely endorsed. There's a famous passage in the book of Proverbs, for example, that says the pur, and a pur, it's a Hebrew word for a lot. The pur is cast in the lap, but its every decision comes from the Lord. And similarly, when you have discussions of various kings inquiring of the Lord, presumably what that involved they would go to the high priest who had the Urim and Thummim and ask him to draw lots to determine the answer to a particular question. And it does seem a little unusual to us today. This is not a practice that we're used to using in our culture. Similar practices are used in other cultures even today. For example, in Asia, the I Ching is often used. It's a practice that involves casting multiple lots at once and then seeing how the sticks that are used in an I Ching casting fall and making a determination about the answer to a question based on that. So this is a practice that's been used in other cultures, and at least for a time in Israel, God chose to use this as a way of communicating with the Israelites. And that practice even peeks over a little bit into the New Testament, as you mentioned, where we see the selection of Matthias rather than the other candidate to replace Judas. Now, some people have looked at that passage in Acts, it's in Acts chapter 1 if you want to look it up, and said actually the apostles shouldn't have done that. They made a mistake. And consequently, they picked the wrong guy, and actually it was God's will for the apostle Paul to be Judas's replacement. That doesn't really fit, though, because it's clear from other things that Luke writes that there were more than just 12 apostles, even if you count Paul as Judas's replacement. Luke also refers, for example, to Barnabas as an apostle, and he was never one of the 12, and you can read about that in Acts chapter 14. So the idea that there were to be only 12 apostles is just a mistake, and once you realize that, and then when you read Acts chapter 1, and you see the apostles are presented as praying to God and asking God to guide their decision, and Luke doesn't censure that in any way. He doesn't give any indication that they're doing something wrong. Then we can have confidence that, in fact, they did the right thing. And so, at least on this occasion, God was willing to work with the institution of lots to indicate his will. But the New Testament was also a transitional age where some things from the Old Testament carried over for a time and ultimately ceased or became manifest in a different way. And that's illustrated by the fact that we no longer have prophets of the same kind that they had in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, they would have prophets who could, for example, write inspired books of Scripture, like Isaiah or Jeremiah or Hosea or Malachi. These prophets could write new books of Scripture. But today, even though we continue to have God giving the church private revelation, we no longer have God giving the church public revelation in the form of new scriptures, or in any other form for that matter. His guidance of the church and his manifestation of his will takes a different form. And over the course of time, it was recognized that God wasn't guiding the church through the casting of lots anymore. That was something that was his will for the Old Testament, and it even peeks over into the New Testament a little bit, but it wasn't his ongoing will, the same way that the giving of public revelation was something that God had in the Old Testament and that continued through the New Testament, but then stopped. And God no longer gives new public revelation, at least until the second coming, the way he did in biblical times. And in the same way, he doesn't use lots anymore the same way he did in biblical times.